I am Dr. Madhumita Bandyopadhyay. I am an associate professor. Today, I will be talking to you about the major theories of history. This is the Unit 4 of the syllabus of MA Part 1, Historiography, Concepts and Tools. In the earlier units, you have learnt the concept of history and the rules of studying and writing history objectively. The writing of history developed a habit of viewing events in their sequence of change. The question then arose, how did history unfold? Was there any discernible pattern in its flow? If so, what was it? And what were its causes? In seeking answers to these questions, philosophers and historians have interpreted history in different ways, leading to various theories of history. In this unit, 3 theories of history will be studied: cyclical, materialism and structuralism. The objectives of the units are the following. 1. To understand the meaning of cyclical history. 2. To analyze various cyclical theories and its implications. To discuss the doctrine of materialistic concept of history. To explain the various factors in relation to materialistic conception of history. To discuss its impact on historiography. To trace the origin and meaning of structuralism, to understand how structuralism has been used in history. So we start with the cyclical theory of history. Now, what is the meaning of cyclical theory of history? The cyclical theory of history is a principle that believes that all events occur in cycles which are relatively similar. Therefore, history moves in a circle, wherein, like nature, it passes through identical patterns of development in periodically repeated rounds. All events thus have a starting point, followed by an upward movement until it reaches the climax. It then has a downward movement until it reaches its lowest point, where it disappears. This process thereafter starts all over again. Hence, the cyclical theory can be compared to the organic view of growth, maturity, decline, downfall, disintegration, and again birth. Now let us look into the evolution of the concept of cyclical theory. The cyclical theory dates back to very ancient times. It was represented in history by means of an analogy with the cyclical processes occurring in nature, such as the changing of the seasons and the development of biological organisms. Such cyclical interpretation has been widely diffused in China, India, the Middle East, and the Greco-Roman world. It has also gained considerable currency among philosophers and historians of the medieval and modern period. The cyclical theory comprises of 3 main approaches. In the first, the circular pattern is restricted to particular dynasties or civilization. Each rises to prosperity before falling to defeat, disaster, or decay. The second approach holds that the whole inhabited earth or the cosmos is passing through a cycle which usually extends over a vast period of time. The conclusion of a cycle may mean the end of all things, or else it may be the prelude to a fresh cycle of a new earth. In the third, the past is a time of steady decline from the lost golden age to the decadence of the present. The 3 approaches integrated with each other, but it is broadly true to say that while the third has colored throughout the world, the first was specially the characteristic of China and the second of India. Now let us look into the different cyclical theories. First we go to China. Traditional Chinese historiography was written in terms of dynasties. Meticulous records were kept to illustrate the rise, growth, and final collapse of dynasties. The main concept was the mandate of heaven given to the first ruler of a dynasty and forfeited by the last. Each dynasty ended with a so-called bad last ruler, whose misrule led to the downfall and subsequent transfer of power. His reign brought misfortune both to dynasty as well as to his subjects. Adversity affected each aspect of life like politics, agriculture, poetry, painting and drama. History written on this schematic model was thought to serve a practical purpose. People turned to history to discover examples of how to live better lives through warnings of what errors to avoid. Those aspiring to public office read history to find concrete illustrations. Many popular texts were written with these purpose books like The Comprehensive Mirror for Aid in Government by Su Ma Kuang and The Outline and Details based on Comprehensive Mirror by Chu Si. History was seen as a body of precedents. The conception of history had two fundamental assumptions. Firstly, similar behavior led to similar consequences, and secondly, patterns of behavior recurred. This was as a result of a disposition to see historical process as a series of cycles. People could thus learn from a history that repeated itself. Now let us look what the cyclical theory was in India. The Indian tradition of cyclical theory encompasses the whole cosmos. The Hindu tradition believes that the universe is cyclically created and destroyed and recreated in an eternally repeated series of cycles. The doctrine emerges in the form of 4 yugas or ages which make up the Mahayuga or the Great Year, a period lasting for 4,320,000 years. The 4 yugas are Satya, Treta, Dwapara and Kali. Each of the yugas is different. Wickedness and general evil grow with every yuga. The last yuga in the series is the Kali Yuga, which is the present period. This too will come to an end with a great fire followed by a flood. In the first yuga, that is the Satya Yuga, virtue or dharma is supreme. In the second, Treta Yuga, it declines. In the third, Dwapara Yuga, it becomes rare. And in the fourth, that is the Kali Yuga, it disappears completely. By the time the fourth Yuga, that is the Kali Yuga, has come to an end, the world is made ready for the beginning of a new great year. But Indian imagination was such that the great years themselves organized into groups of thousands called kalpas. The yugas varied in length. Satya Yuga, that is the golden age, was the longest, while the Kali Yuga, which began on 18th Feb 3102 BC, will be the shortest. It is fascinating that the 4 yugas have some of the features of the human life cycle in that the capacity for committing evils enters after childhood and increases until old age. One can therefore conclude that the Indian psychical theory that people must resign themselves to a pattern of perpetual recurrence. There was therefore no point in seeking guidance from the past as the Chinese attempted to do. In fact, it held that the world of human beings, especially in the decadent present, was unworthy of detailed consideration. Therefore, people of early India did not maintain records of history. Cosmic cycles thus bred passivity. Now let us see what was the theory like in the ancient Middle East. Elements of Indian cyclical theory can be detected in beliefs of history in ancient Middle East. There was a Persian conception of 4 successive ages that clearly resemble the Indian 4 yugas. Zoroastrianism refers to 4 successive ages of gold, silver, steel, and a mixture including iron. The metals were intended to symbolize a progressive decadence. The thought that the times are steadily growing worse, though present in the Indian conception, is overshadowed by an awareness that fresh cycles will take place. In Persia, by contrast, there was no doctrine of eternal recurrence. There could be only one cycle of 4 ages, each worse than the last. the process would inexorably to a time of judgment when there would be universal cataclysm. Another cyclical theory can be seen in early Babylonian Empire of 2nd millennium BC. The past is seen by them as a cyclical pattern of happiness and disaster as dynasties rose and fell much on the Chinese model. Now let us see what was the theory of cyclical in Greece and Rome. The influence of Persia is perceptible in ancient Greece. Hesiod, a Greek poet, probably of the 8th century BC, writes of a sequence of races beginning with one of gold and ending with the present race of iron. The golden race experienced the joys of paradise. A silver race followed, which was less gifted with years and wisdom, yet better than the later ones. This was followed by the bronze race of heroes, and finally the race of iron, where the people were feeble and wicked and destined to grow worse. Although this theory is akin to the Persian pattern, Hesiod strikes on a different course by inserting a race of heroes in the series of metallic races. Thus, it seems that it was an attempt by him to provide a slot in this scheme for Greek mythical heroes like Heracles and Jason. He therefore integrated two bodies of thought, Greek myth incorporated in a Persian world view. Another Greek philosopher, Empedocles, gave a cyclical view that gave ground for optimism. Although there is decadence, he gives hope of the return of a new cycle with the idyllic period, as each cycle repeated the characteristics of its predecessors, like that of the Indian cyclical theory. According to him, the course of cosmic history began from a period when the force of love was in command. This was followed by the entrance of strife upon the scene, to be followed in turn by the predominance of strife, apparently the worst of times. But when strife was uppermost, it began to give way again to love, and finally love returned to take over management of the universe. The rhythm was thus endless. A similar theory of cosmic cycle had been put forth by the Stoics, who belonged to a school of Hellenistic philosophy of 3rd century BC. According to them, there would occur at a given time a general conflagration, that is fire, the ikpyrosis, that is what he says, after which the world would begin as it was in the distant past. The cycle was called as the Great Year, which also means annus magnus. Its length was variously calculated, now being 18,000 solar years and the other 10,800. Another philosopher, Cleanthes, one of the founder of Stoicism, described the ekpyrosis as a process of death and growth. The fire burns up all things, but is followed by a period of moisture in which the seeds of everything remain. These seeds begin to grow at the proper time, and eventually the cosmos is restored to what it was. The world thus turns out to be self-destructive and self-regenerative, just like a phoenix. The other ancient Greek philosophers have also shown traces of cyclical conception of history. Plato, in his work Statesman, writes that all history is advance and retrogression. These occurs in cycle, but only the most prominent features of them are repeated, not the details. In his opinion, world history has two periods. One is in which God is its guide, and one in which it changes its course and moves under its own power in the reverse direction. The change of direction entails a great destruction of all animals, and only a few humans are left alive. After this, history is just reverse of what we are used to. The living grows younger and finally disappears, and a new race is born of the earth. Aristotle too gives a hint of cyclical theory in his work Metaphysics, where he writes that arts and sciences have been lost and regained many times. But he gives no account of how and why men lost their acquired knowledge or any story of cataclysmic destruction of races or nations. He is also responsible for the idea of the degeneration of the forms of government. He says that there are three kinds of good government: the rule of one man, that is monarchy; the rule of a few, that is aristocracy; and many, that is constitutional democracy. Corresponding to these are three forms of bad government: tyranny, which is government in the interest of the ruler; oligarchy, in the interest of the rich; and democracy, in the interest of the needy. He points out that first, governments were monarchical, then degenerated into tyrannies, and finally into democracies. However, Aristotle does not say that monarchies will arise anew out of democracy. The process is not eternal. Among the Greek historians, Polybius' belief that history must recur has been developed as a constitutional theory. He writes in his work, The Histories, that Rome, like all other states, must grow and decay in a cycle. He says that there are 6 kinds of government that occur in a definite series. By a natural growth, monarchy comes first and turns into kingship by the aid of act of correction of defects. Both are government by one man. Monarchy turns tyrannical, against which aristocracy is organized. Aristocracy in turn degenerates into oligarchy. Revulsion against oligarchy produces democracy, which in its turn becomes mob rule. Thus, Polybius anticipates Lord Acton's dictum that power corrupts. But to Polybius' way of thinking, the cycle is established by natural law. It is a course appointed by nature in which constitutions, states, art change, disappear, and finally return to the point from which they started. The cyclical theory was thus widely diffused in the ancient world. However, the Christian view of history supplanted the cyclical theory. This seems to have because of 2 reasons. It contradicted the essential Christian dogma of free will, for if everything recurs in the same manner, then all choice is eliminated. Moreover, cosmic cycle would mean that Christ would be born, crucified, and resurrected again. Among the Arab historians, Ibn Khaldun, who belonged to the 14th century AD, propounds the cyclical theory of state. He observes that the state, which has a natural growth, cannot be formed by urban civilization, which lack the essential ingredients, asabiya. Asabiya is found in the more primitive kinds of social structures, such as that of the nomads and the semi-nomads, who possess strength, courage, and endurance. A nomadic community led by a wazir, that is a leader, conquers an existing dynasty or state or finds a new one. The state, once established, the royal authority, that is the mulk, proceeds through a natural sequence of growth, maturity, decline, and fall. No dynasty could expect to survive for more than 3 or at the most 4 generations. Civilization inevitably erodes tribal asabiya. The ruler becomes absolute and begins to rely on the paid army and bureaucracy, and no longer on the virile tribesmen. Luxury and leisure becomes the aim of life. The state then enters a period of senile decay. Thus a new dynasty or state is established, only to suffer the same inexorable fate. The cyclical theory has been revived by some European thinkers intermittently. The Italian thinker Grambattista Vico, whose span is between 1668 to 1744, explained the cyclical development of all nations in 4 phases. the age of gods, the age of heroes, the age of men, and the age of barbarians. In the first phase, gods and their legends dominate social thought. In the second, heroes and their episodes become predominant. In the third, the classical civilization has its beginnings, and thought takes the place of imagination, prose of poetry, industry of agriculture, and peace of war. In the fourth phase, thought and philosophy are bogged down in useless morass of relative values and useless formalities. The historical rhythm beats like this. First, brute strength is dominant. Then, valiant heroic strength, brilliant originality. Then, constructive reflection. And lastly, a kind of spendthrift and wasteful opulence which destroys what has been created. The nature of people is first crude, then severe, then benign, then delicate, and finally dissolute. Accordingly, men first feel necessity, then look for beauty, still later indulge in luxury and pleasure, and finally dissipate themselves into destruction. Friedrich Nietzsche, whose span of life is between 1844 to 1900, was a German philosopher who puts forth the theory of eternal return, also known as eternal recurrence, which posits that the universe has been recurring and will continue to recur in a self-similar form an infinite number of times across infinite time or space. It is a purely physical concept involving no supernatural reincarnation but the return of beings in the same bodies. He thought that since there is no end of time and presumably only a finite number of events and things, everything now existing must recur. He said, "The plexus of causes returneth in which I am intertwined. It will again create me. I myself pertain to the causes of the eternal return. I will come again with this earth, with this eagle, with this serpent knot, to a new life, or a better life, or a similar life. I come again eternally to this identical and self-same life." Nietzsche was probably the strongest intellectual influence over another German historian and philosopher, Oswald Spengler, whose span of life was between 1880 to 1936. He treated human societies as organisms that pass through 4 distinct phases of life cycle. In the first phase, which is the pre-culture stage, man was naked, carnivorous, nomadic, and a beast of prey. The second stage is agricultural, where there was no politics, no classes, no masses, and no state. The next phase, the decisive moment in the growth of culture, is the creation of the rational religion, in which Kultursili, that is the soul of a culture, finds its conscious form. Political organizations, arts and sciences are developed, first in an archaic manner, then blossoming into classical excellence at the height of its creativity. The final phase of culture period is the civilization phase, in which people become highly sophisticated, urbanized, and transformed into a parasitical society. Decadence then sets in, and culture finally sinks into a new type of barbarism. Arnold Toynbee, whose span of life is between 1889 to 1975, was an Oxford historian. In his work of 10 volumes, A Study of History, he puts forward a cyclical development and decline of civilization. Thus, like Spengler, he compared the fortunes of whole societies larger than nations. However, he was more careful in formulating his list of 21 civilizations and far more detailed in his comparisons. The key concept in Toynbee's theory is that of challenge and response. Every society faces challenges, and the nature of response determines its fate. He pointed out that history is a series of cycles of growth and decay. However, Toynbee's views are very optimistic than Spengler, for he does not believe that all civilizations will inevitably decay, but each new civilization is able to learn from the mistakes of the earlier ones. It is therefore possible for each new cycle to offer higher level of achievements. Now, let us look into the implications of the cyclical theory. We have looked into the various theories, and let us see how cyclical theory has been affecting our life. To sum up, we may say that the cyclical theory advanced by the different philosophers and thinkers makes history a discipline through which human beings become wiser. It instructs the future about the effect of a particular action and warns them against wrong deeds. Such a thought is especially reflected in China as well as in Toynbee's cyclical theory. Therefore, history becomes a philosophy teaching by examples and a scope for better life in the future. However, the theory put up by Indian, Persian, early Greeks and Vico makes history fatalistic. It reiterates that there is an inevitable degeneration in the society which has to be accepted. Some theories, like those of Aristotle, Polybius, and Ibn Khaldun, have traced the evolution of the various forms of government. While some philosophers have an optimistic view of future political system, others reflect a successive deterioration of the government. So this is the end of the cyclical theory. Now we start with the next theory, that is materialistic conception of history. What is materialistic conception of history? The view of life and history developed by Karl Marx, the German philosopher and thinker, is variously called as the materialistic conception of history, or dialectical materialism, or historical materialism. According to this theory, the basic element in human life is materialistic or economic. It is the material production which forms the base of mankind's history and determines the other aspects of human life. Therefore, the basic causative factor in history is at all times the economic factor. The principal features of materialistic interpretation may be discussed under the following heads. The first is mode of production and economic determinism. Marx regards the existing of living human individuals as the basis of all human history. The first fact to be established, therefore, is the physical constitution of these individuals and their consequent relation to the rest of nature. Nature is modified in the course of history by the activities of human beings. While doing so, they distinguish themselves from animals by producing their means of subsistence. Thereby, they produce their actual material life. The way in which men produce their subsistence depends in the first place on the nature of the existing means which they have to reproduce. This mode of production is not just the reproduction of the physical existence of individuals. It is a definite form of activity of those individuals, a definite way of expressing their life, and a definite mode of life. Therefore, what individuals are coincides with their production, with what they produce and how they produce. Consequently, an individual's condition depends on the material condition of their production, which forms the base of the human society. The mode of production determines society's other relationships and ideas, which are described as its superstructure. ideas and institutions, laws and politics, and even religion and art are thereby greatly affected by economic factors. The conception of history therefore rests on the exposition of the real process of production and the understanding of the form of intercourse connected with and created by this mode of production, that is, of civil society in its various stages, as the basis of all history. Unlike the idealistic view of history, the materialistic conception does not explain practice from idea, but explains the formation of ideas from material practice. Marx talks about the stages of history. Let us look into this. Marx argued that history has progressed through a series of stages: primitive communism, slavery, feudalism, and capitalism. Each of these stages is determined by the prevailing conditions under which wealth is produced. In a slave-owning economy, wealth was produced by the ownership of slaves. In the feudal stage, from the ownership of land, while in the capitalist period, from the ownership of factories. Each stage developed an ideology and superstructure suited to its needs. The next important principle is dialectical motion of society or class struggle. Marx viewed that it is class struggle or class war which is the cause for the development from one stage to another. This class struggle is due to a dialectical motion, which means opposing forces in history caused by the antagonistic interest of economic classes created by the prevailing mode of production. Therefore, Marx declared that history of all society existing then was the history of class struggle. Classes were formed by a relationship of ownership or non-ownership of the means of production. Therefore, since the establishment of private society, it has been divided into two hostile economic classes, the exploiters and the exploited. In the slave-owning ancient world, the interests of the slave owners were opposed to that of the slaves. In the feudal stage, the interest of the feudal lord was opposed to that of the serfs. And in our own times, the interest of the capitalist class, that is the bourgeoisie, is antagonistic to the interest of the working class, that is the proletariat. History is therefore a story of class war. The ideas of the ruling class are in every stage the ruling ideas. That is, the class which the dominant material force in society is at the same time the dominant intellectual force. The class which has the means of material production at its disposal has a control at the same time over the means of mental production, so that in consequence the ideas of those who lack the means of mental production are in general subject to it. Therefore, the individuals composing the ruling class possess among other things consciousness and therefore think. They rule as thinkers and producers of ideas of this age. Consequently, their ideas are the ruling ideas of the age. A division of labor, which is one of the principal forces of history up to the present time, manifests itself also in the ruling class as the division of mental and material labor. Within this class, one appear as thinkers of the class, while the other has a more passive and receptive attitude, because in reality they are the active members of this class and has less time to make up ideas. Now, the other principle is the theory of surplus value. In his work Das Kapital, Marx declared that labor was the source of all wealth, as it was they who created surplus value. Surplus value can be explained as the value that labor produces above the cost of tools, raw materials, and the cost of its own subsistence. He states that the primary reason for antagonism between labor and capital is that capitalism are able to appropriate the surplus value which is created by labor. This surplus value ought to go to the labor as they have created it. But the capitalists, through their ownership and control of means of production, deprive labor of the wealth that it has created. In fact, the modern state is a committee of bourgeoisie to protect it from rebellion by the proletariat who suffer from this process of exploitation. Now let us go to the next idea of Marx, that is social revolution. Marx believed in revolution as a powerful force for social progress. He observed that at the conclusion of each historical age, a point is reached when new productive forces come into conflict with existing class relations or property relations. The conflict leads to social revolution. There were slave revolts in the ancient world, peasant revolts in the medieval age, and there was social revolution when feudal society gave way to bourgeoisie in England in 1642, in France in 1789, and in Germany in 1848. The class which makes a revolution appears from the beginning not as a class, but as a representative of the whole society. It appears then as if the whole mass of society was confronting the single ruling class. The victory of the revolutionary class benefits many individuals of the other classes which were not in a dominant position. These individuals are in a position to raise themselves into the ruling class. The same can be seen in the French Revolution. Predicting the future, Marx states that there is bound to be social revolution with the development of capitalism. This would lead to the final stage of the society where capitalist class is overthrown by the proletariat. The latter would then simply seize the means of production and thereby abolish private property. Every stage in this historical process is therefore rendered inevitable by the compulsions of material production. Marx gives another view, that is the view of the new society. Now let us see what it is. To stabilize the gains of the social revolution, that is, overthrow of the capitalist class, a dictatorship of the proletariat will be established. The Communist Manifesto envisages a utopia in which the state will wither away into a classless society in which each will contribute to the social wealth according to his capacity and take from it what he needs. Now let us look into the impact of materialistic interpretation of history on historiography. Marx's materialistic conception of history represented a turning point in historiography. It had a pervasive influence on history writing as it provided a new perspective. History was no longer a mere collection of facts, but a study of the interconnection of those facts. Marx's base and superstructure model, inquiry into the mode of production, class struggle, surplus value are used extensively by historians all over the world to explain historical changes. The influence of Marxism on modern historiography could also be seen in the emphasis it laid on economic and social history. History has diverted its attention from political histories, that is from individual rulers and activities of the state, to the ordinary people. The great man has been replaced by the great many in the study of history. The conception of history as the study of society has also led to the subaltern studies. However, Marx is also criticized by many. Marx's interpretation of history is indefensible on philosophical grounds because it excludes free will and non-material realities generally from any share in history making. Criticizing Marx on this point, Mendel M. Bobers writes, Marx's theory is important to account for historical processes, and the reason is that it fails to ascribe sufficient weight to the non-economic processes in history. Edwin R. A. Seligman, pointing out the inadequacy of the theory by reason of its elimination of non-economic factors, observes that as a philosophical system of universal validity, the theory of historical materialism can no longer be successfully defended. No one denies that physical and economic causes and conditions play a significant, sometimes a tremendous part in history. However, the mistake is to make them play the whole part. The German historian Tritzke wrote that Marx completely lacked a scholar's conscience and knew what he wanted to prove even before the research started. A.J.P. Taylor echoes the same observation when he said that Marx decided beforehand what he wanted to discover. Marx held that it was possible to establish laws of social development and thereby predict social change. Marxian dialect has been profuse in making predictions and in offering explanations of everything that had ever happened or could happen. But John Whitman shows how Marx's predictions have not been borne by facts. The proletariats have not grown progressively poorer. Marx's belief that revolution would occur in advanced societies have never been realized. In fact, all Marxist revolutions have occurred largely in peasant societies such as Russia, China, Yugoslavia and Cuba, and in situations different from those envisaged by Marx. Free trade has not spread all through the world as he had assumed. His belief that the cause of internationalism would prove stronger than nationalism has proved false. However, it can be concluded that the materialistic conception of history has introduced a new method of inquiry. It has questioned the conventional separate histories of politics, law, religion and thought, and has put forth the view that human societies are systems in which social groups, institutions, beliefs and doctrines are interrelated and have to be synthesized rather than being treated in isolation. Marx can therefore be credited for bringing forth an approach in studying history that unravels the complex process of human development. Now let us look into another unconventional way of looking history. This is the structuralism in history. This is the next philosophy that we'll be looking into. Let us start with what is structuralism. Structuralism is derived from the term structure, which means an organized body or combination of mutually connected parts or elements. Structuralism can be broadly defined as a belief that understands things not in isolation, but in the context of larger structures they are part of. It highlights an interpretation of event where meaning can be well understood when seen from outside and not just from inside. If an analogy is drawn between chicken and eggs, the structuralist would determine the precise nature of the chicken to understand the meaning of the egg instead of restricting themselves to the analysis of the egg only. Therefore, it is an approach which concentrates upon the manner in which the individual elements define one another within a system. To understand the implications of structuralism in history, it would be necessary to first look into its roots and its application in various fields. Beginnings of structuralism. The roots of structuralism can be traced to the thoughts of Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure. His linguistic theories represented a major conceptual revolution with far-reaching implications. Saussure's understanding of language can be summarized as three basic principles. Firstly, he emphasized that meanings of words are purely arbitrary and that these meanings are maintained by convention only. Therefore, words are unmotivated signs. It follows from this that there is no inherent connection between a word and what it designates. For instance, the word girl is not appropriate to its meaning. All such linguistic signs are arbitrary like this, except for a few onomatopic words like hiss and cuckoo, but they too vary between languages. Therefore, language is not a reflection of the world and of experience, but a system which stands quite separate from it. Secondly, Saussure highlighted that the meanings of the words are relational. This means that no word can be defined in isolation from the other. A meaning of a word depends on its relation with the other adjoining words. For example, the word girl depends for its precise meaning on its position in a syntagmatic chain, that is, a chain of words related in function and meaning, each of which could be substituted for any of the words in a given sentence. The syntagmatic chain in this case include girl and woman. If we pair the two words together, they have meanings in relation to the other. Thirdly, Saussure emphasized that meanings of words is always attributed to the object or idea by the human mind. It is constructed and expressed through language as is not already contained within the thing. For example, the revolt of 1857 has been differently interpreted by different historians as mutiny or a revolt. Therefore, we can conclude that every individual has their own version of a particular event and all the terms explaining the event are purely linguistic. Saussure also used the terms langue and parole to explain the larger structures which were relevant to literature. Langue meant language as a system or structure, while parole was an utterance in that language. For example, a particular remark in French, parole, would make sense only if one knew the rules and conventions of the French language, which Saussure mentions as language. Therefore, an individual remark made sense only when seen in the context of a wider structure. It can therefore be concluded that Saussure's approach concentrates upon the manner in which individual elements mutually define one another within a system. Let us look into the scope of structuralism. In the 1950s, the scope of structuralism was broadened. It was applied to subjects other than literature. The French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, whose lifespan is between 1908 to 2009, made use of structuralism in the study of myth. He suggested that the individual tale, that is the parole, from a cycle of myths did not have a separate and inherent meaning, but could only be understood by considering its position in the whole cycle, that is the langue, and the similarities and differences between that tale and others in a sequence. For example, while interpreting the Oedipus myth, he placed the individual story of Oedipus within the whole context of the whole cycle of tales connected with the city of Thebes. This is a typical structuralist process of moving from the particular to the general, placing the individual work within a wider structuralist context. Another major figure in the early phase of structuralism was Roland Barthes, whose span of life was between 1915 to 1980. He was a French philosopher. He applied the structuralist method to the general field of modern culture. He examined modern France of the 1950s from the standpoint of a cultural anthropologist in a book called Mythologies, published in 1957 in France. He looked at a number of subjects that had never been intellectually analyzed, such as difference between boxing and wrestling, the significance of eating steak and chips, etc. Each of these items was placed within a wider structure of values, beliefs and symbols as the key to understanding it. For instance, boxing has been seen as a sport concerned with repression and endurance, while wrestling, which is distinctly different, displays pain flamboyantly. He demonstrates that human culture can be conceptualized with the methods developed by Saussure, and an area of human experience can be viewed with a new precision. Now let us see how structuralism has been used in history. Structuralism in history is an approach where the past is viewed horizontally rather than vertically. Therefore, unlike the traditional narrative history, the structural approach looks upon the past as a number of state of affairs existing at the same time instead of seeing it as a sequence of events through time. Structuralism in history also analyzes and interprets historical phenomena and historical change in terms of geographical, economic, and mental structures and systems. It treats a single, autonomous, and individual historical process and a particular historical event as imaginary and artificial. It considers political narratives as superficial. The beginnings of structuralism in history can be seen through the journal Annals, which was founded in 1929 by the French historians Lucien Febvre and Marc Bloch, in which they articulated their disappointment with the traditional methods of history, stressing on distinct events, politics, and Rankian cult of detail. Inspired by Henry Burr, the French philosopher, they held that all social sciences, including history, were interdependent. They studied history with emphasis on social psychology, human geography, the various ways in which societies reacted to the physical environment, mentalities, that is, collective ideas and beliefs of the people, and their collective influence on human lives. They stressed on the importance of the social and the collective in the life of historical agent. Such an approach may broadly be termed as structural. It was also emphasized that the description of an event by the historian is not based on facts but the presupposition of the meaning of the source. Now let us look into structuralism by Fernand Braudel, which is called as Braudelian structuralism. Now who was Braudel? Braudel, that is Fernand Braudel, was a French historian and he is renowned for his leadership of Annals school. The Annals paradigm during the years of Braudel's leadership was related to the structuralist models that have captivated social science. The Annals history believed that events were constituted largely by the force of many different conjectural and structural circumstances. It replaced historical positivism and looked at history in a new way in which the individual agent, that is the actor, and the individual occurrence, that is the event, were not the central elements in social explanation. Braudel was dissatisfied with conventional history, which believed in two ideas: the supremacy of extraordinary actor heroes and the influence of the immediate and the dramatic in human lives. Braudel held that through structural history, one could uncover the impersonal forces which in reality fashion men and their destinies and plot the slower rhythms at which social time in fact moved. Therefore, the most vital change wrought by the Annals historians was of going beyond the individual and the particular event. Structuralism in history therefore attempted to reveal those impersonal forces and hidden realities which mold man's life and their destinies. Brodel synthesized history with other social sciences. He affirmed that history is a scientific enterprise sharing with other social sciences a single identifiable goal that is progressively achievable. Brodel is known for his chief work, The Mediterranean and the Mediterranean in the Age of Philip II, which was written between 1972 to 1973. Here, he applies the structural notions of historical change and the multi-form springs of action. The Mediterranean is divided into three parts, which Brodel described as dealing with three kinds of time: geographical, social, and individual, each with a different pace of change. He gave to the traditional eventful history, consisting of the twists and turns of politics, people, military history, which is in the part 3 of the Mediterranean, the minimum importance. This, he says, portrays short, rapid events and individual actors which in the eyes of the structuralists are of the least historical significance. The second part, which represents a slowly rhythmic history of groups and groupings, is of greater moment, consisting of time of conjectures or time spans of 10, 20, 50 or even more years, when broader movements of economies, social structures, political institutions and civilizations take shape. Now, this was the part 2 of the Mediterranean. But according to him, the most important sector for the structuralists is the bottom layer of geohistory, which seeks to grasp the mean history of man's relation with the milieu surrounding him. It consists of mountains, plains, and the sea. This is the part 1 of the Mediterranean, which Brodel describes as Histoire de longue durée, or history of the longest duration, because here time is almost stationary or moves at the lowest pace. This is a sphere left untouched by the traditional narrative history of individual events and men. It is here that a historian requires perspective of centuries to plot any change at all. It comprises of man's biological, geophysical and climatic circumstances, to which Brodel has given the name structures. To the structuralists, therefore, the mountains, the plains, the peninsulas, the sea itself, even time and space constitutes the real actors who make the real history. Brodel's history attributes these structures with personified entities, that is, heroes, who design and determine history. These geographical agents or structures influence history by getting in its way, hindering its flow, and thereby shaping it. It is the sphere of longue durée which limits and constrains human beings and within frameworks in which they are obliged to act. Stressing the importance of geographical factors in the life of mankind, Brodel said, for centuries, man has been a prisoner of climate, of vegetation, of the animal population, of a particular agriculture, of a whole slowly established balance from which he cannot escape without the risk of everything being upset. Brodel's structuralism made a vital contribution to social history by determining the effects of structures on those who inhabit them. All infrastructural changes such as climate, vegetation, animal population and so on were considered to be in due course responsible for what goes on in other time sectors of history. Brodel cites the example of biological revolution of the 16th century, which was, in his opinion, more important than the other political factors like the Turkish conquest and the discovery and colonization of America. He treats society not as a diversity of groups, but as a single whole, everywhere the same, although exemplified with greater or lesser clarity in different locales. Brodel affirmed that individual actions were both infinitely varied and yet similar in basic ways. In tune with structuralism, Brodel had a pronounced hostility to events and to history as made by individuals. He considers them as superficial and illusory. To him, real history was the history of the long run, for only here are to be found the real actors, whose actions have consequences that are intense and long-lasting because they are determinative. Just as the destinies of the Turks and the Christians alike were unknowingly established by common patterns of climate, terrain and vegetation in the Mediterranean region, so Philip II and his advisors were blind to the fact that their actions were responses to seismic shifts in its geohistory. After looking into Brodelian structuralism, now let us make an assessment of structuralism. Annals history of Mark and February were different from Brodel's structural history in certain respects. The former treated events and structures as complementary aspects of reality and gave equal importance to the will and intention of the individuals. However, Brodel gives utmost importance to structures, while to him, human beings are considered to be non-entity with no influence on history. Brodel's abhorrence against individuals and political narratives is extreme. He had exaggerated the importance of geophysical structures to such an extent that it questions whether his triad of time spans could be put up a truly whole view of human affairs. Historiography would benefit more if structural history and history of events are brought jointly for a complete explanation of human life. However, structuralism is still a very valuable tool as it provides us a conceptual framework for the study of history. It penetrates beneath the surface and gives new insights into patterns which structure the human life. It provides a new appreciation to the complex structure which lies below all aspects of our culture, whether it is classical, popular and folk. Now let us sum up all the three theories that we have just looked into. In this unit, we have seen the three major theories of history. We began with the cyclical theory, whose origin can be traced to the ancient times. This theory has been put up by different scholars from all over the world who have looked into cosmic cycles as well as cycles in human affairs. We then went on to see the materialistic conception of history, a theory which has been put up by the German scholar Karl Marx. This theory has a remarkable impact on the writing of history, whereby the focus of historians have shifted from political to economic and social history. A similar theory, which broke the shackles of conventional history of individuals and events, is the structural theory, which was originally introduced by the Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure. However, as we have seen, the scope of structuralism has been extended to other subjects, including history. And we have seen the application of structuralism in the writings of Ferdinand Brodel. So with this, I conclude this unit. Thank you.